Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Socialist Action Webcast. And I would like to wish all of our viewers live and those who will watch us later on the SA YouTube a happy Red New Year. So, all the best for 2025. And I'm so glad that Comrade Jeff Mackler is here because I had greetings going out to him too from SA Canada to send get well wishes to him. And of course, Jeff is the leader of our sister party in the US. So I'm glad that you're here, Jeff. Very glad. So once again, welcome to the Socialist Action Webcast. This is webcast number 1 in the 2025 series. My name is Elizabeth Bice, and I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, and a past Executive Secretary, Toronto New York Region Labour Council. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat and Haudenosaunee people, in a place called Toronto. Today, I am speaking to you from Jamaica, the West Indies, where the indigenous Taino and Arawak-speaking people began arriving 4,000 years ago. They were wiped out by the European colonial powers. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is degrowth versus capitalist production and consumption. The special guest speaker is Michael Roberts, a Marxist economist based in the UK. He is the author of several books: The Great Recession, A Marxist View, 2009, The Long Depression, 2016, Marx 200, An Analysis of Marx Economics, 2018, Engels 200, Is Economics, 2020, and Capitalism in the 21st Century with G. Garcetti, 2023, in which degrowth is discussed. He has also spent time analyzing the nature of the Chinese economy. He blogs regularly on the world economy and Marxist economic issued at thenextrecession.wordpress.com. Marxists has an undeserved reputation for urging more and more production of things to overcome poverty and the necessities of life. However, is the production of more and more really the answer to scarcity? Or should our aim be to produce better rather than more? Or we need to ask, to what end should productivity increase? For whom and what costs? Requiring what level of exploitation and measured by what criteria? And how could the goal of useful production be realized democratically and equitably on a world scale before it's too late for nature and humanity? We are pleased to have Michael Roberts with us today to address this critical question. He will speak for about 45 minutes to be followed by questions and comments from you, the audience. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Michael Roberts.
Thank you so much, everybody, for inviting me to speak on this subject. Elizabeth summed up the questions very well that we will try to discuss in this session about whether we just need more growth, whether we need better growth, or in the case of the proponents of the idea of degrowth, they're talking about less growth as a solution to the problems of capitalist excess and failure around the world. And that's their aim, or that's their approach that they want to adopt to the alternative of the current situation of production for production's sake or production for profit, as it may seem. In order to discuss what the degrowth arguments are and whether they have any validity or what the defects are of them, I'm going to present to you a few slides, presentation. It's traditional for Michael Roberts to do this. So this will be give you an opportunity, I think, to explain the situation a bit more graphically. So I'm just going to share some graphs with you. So you should be able to see that. So simple title, Degrowth. And what it starts really, right, go back to the early 1970s when the Club of Rome produced a project in which they discussed the fact that a number of people came together, discussed whether it was mankind was just expanding production at a huge rate, quite unnecessarily, to the point where it was created the situation where population was growing and there were going to be limits to the ability of economies, specifying whether they're capitalist or not, to expand to meet the needs of the population. And if there's too much expansion, we need to limit that growth. It's unnecessary to have this unending demand for more growth. And a number of authors since then have presented this point of view, and I'm going to show you to some extent what their arguments are in this short presentation. Their view boils down to this: if we're going to really get control of the economy so that it's used in the interests of the population as a whole, we need not to just go on expanding, trying to increase productivity, accumulating more. We need to move gradually to what they would call a steady state economy. And you can see in this spiral graph, which is presented by degrowth supporters, they start off with the idea that gradually we reduce the level of output so it comes down to a level where it's just maintaining a steady state. It's just replacing what's getting worn out. Whether it's resources, whether it's machinery, whether it's human labor, we're just moving to a society which just goes round and round in a steady state. As one of the authors of Degrowth says, we would have a steady state economy, an economy with constant stocks of people and artifacts maintained by the lowest feasible flows of matter and energy. In order to achieve that, we would eventually, in this circular process, shrink, in particular the rich economies like Canada, the United States, the so-called G7 economies in the mainly northern part of the world, by as much as 1/3 in terms of GDP on their output, and only replace really worn out stock that has to be replaced, rather than expanding unnecessarily to yet more levels of accumulation of more things that we don't really need and are in fact a waste. That's the basic argument of degrowth. They're saying we don't need these things. The expansion is causing climate change, global warming. It's increasing inequalities between the North and the South. It is destroying the environment. It's wasting resources and exerting pressures upon humanity. We need to have a society that is steady, not growing without any limit at all. So in the view of many of these authors, and according to the website of the European Degrowth Project, they have a website, degrowth carries the idea of a voluntary reduction of the size of the economic system, which implies a reduction of the GDP. And they particularly emphasize what we call GDP, which is a capitalist measure of how much is produced in an economy, gross domestic product, and that the aim of the gross domestic product is to bring together in money terms all the things that are produced, the services and things that are produced in any one economy and of course on the world as a whole. And the view of degrowth is that we should not be continuing to increase GDP, but on the contrary, we should be attempting to reduce GDP as measured by the general ones that are used by the big agencies. One of the authors of this degrowth approach, Latouche, said the concept of degrowth signifies a major social change, he says, which it clearly would, a radical shift from growth as the main objective of the modern economy towards its opposite, contraction, downshifting. So this is the alternative presented to the way capitalism operates at the moment. Does that mean that they want to replace capitalism? Well, I'll come to that point in a moment, but to emphasize again, and here's another author, Jason Hickel, who is probably the most sophisticated presenter of the argument of degrowth, that less is more. If we can use degrowth, it will save the world in the way I've described. We'll be able to live better with less. And it's time to move to that sort of economy and society. So let's consider the degrowth economy. I dragged this out of the European project for degrowth. Your first argument is that countries have overshot ecological limits and they should scale back on non-essential production and consumption to lessen environmental impacts and decarbonize more rapidly. They should reduce reliance on cheap fossil energy, that we should reduce the use of material-intensive luxuries like SUVs, private jets, oversized homes, which are massively carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and are totally unnecessary in society's majority of people. Stop unsustainable practices such as the industrial production, industrialization of meat and agriculture in general, and also the culture of fast fashion, which massively uses resources around the world and exploits human labor in doing so. Curb the wealth excesses of the very rich, the huge super rich, whose wealth is totally grotesque and certainly something that's unnecessary in a world which should be of quality and aiming to meet the needs of the world's population. Promote public resources like public transportation over private use, private vehicle use. Foster a culture of durability and repairability. Stop producing new things, slightly different gadgets and so on. Just use gadgets that work, consumer goods and things that work well without the necessity of continually trying to replace them, repair them if they break down rather than just replace them, and all the waste that goes in as following repairing, rather than repairing, but removing and replacing products altogether all over again. The waste piles up all around the world, mostly in the third world, or they were called global south, in huge levels of garbage and so on as a result. Guarantee universal access to high quality public services like healthcare, education, childcare and transportation. Ensure affordable housing and living wages for all. Implement a public job guarantee so that government provides jobs to those who are willing and able to work. We're funding that jobs guarantee or promise as well. So this is the degrowth program presented, and degrowth is supposed to be able to achieve all these particular things here and make it at least easier to achieve. So in some way, I mean, if you look down that list, which you have before you now, it's very difficult not to disagree. In fact, you would agree with that we need to carry out most, if not all, of these things that are presented here. The question is, does degrowth enable us in some way to achieve these particular targets for working people around the world? Is the principles of degrowth based on sustainability, circularity, which we saw before, waste not, want not, cooperation amongst people, produce things that are useful, not what is not needed, reach a certain level of self-sufficiency, sufficiency for all and excess for none, produce local, consume local, get a right work-life balance, produce less stuff and have more contact between humanity, and to open up the possible of freedom and time for people. These apparently are the principles of degrowth. You might say that they're pretty close to the principles of some sort of socialist way of looking of society in the future. So why emphasize this particular question of degrowth as opposed to socialism? And I think that's the question we have to consider. And here's one of the things I found in reading through some of the degrowth authors is that as far as they're concerned, degrowth does not need the end of capitalism. For example, Latouche says that eco-compatible capitalism is conceivable. So it's to achieve all the program that we've just discussed or seen, to end some of the excesses which they've talked about, degrowth theorists. They're saying we don't have to get rid of capitalism, replace it with anything. We just have to make it be more in the interests of society in general. So we need a regulation of the economy is still feasible to tame capitalism and push it down the virtuous path of eco-capitalism. So there's eco-capitalism that could exist, and it will be where we have to drive programs and policies and action in this direction. Degrowth is not aimed at breaking the dialectic of capital and wage labor, so exploitation would continue under these authors' views, or interfering with the private ownership of the means of production. So again, it's not a question of getting rid of private ownership, it's not a getting rid of the class struggle or ending the profit-making system, it's just making that system be directed in taming, regulating the economy so it ends all the excesses that we've just seen in the previous program. Immediately that springs to my mind as a Marxist to know very well that this is the sort of demands or approach that we get in general from reformists in the labour movement, that they think it's possible to reform capitalism in such a way to make it operate in the interests of working people and against the interests of big business and the super rich that the degrowth people talk about. So that raises some considerable doubt to me that this idea, this use of the word degrowth on its own, doesn't really change the picture for how we can go forward towards a better society for society as a whole. For example, one of the authors of Degrowth, Daly, says a society based on economic contraction cannot exist under capitalism. So we can't have degrowth under capitalism. But capitalism is a deceptively simple word for a long and complex history. Getting rid of the capitalists and banning wage labour, currency and private ownership of the means of production would plunge society into chaos. It would bring large-scale terrorism, says Daly. So although it means we can't get degrowth without getting rid of capitalism, he then goes on to say we can't get rid of capitalism because all these things would cause such a revolutionary situation, a society in chaos, and terrorism he refers to. So we need to find another way out of this development, out of economism or belief in the primacy of economic causes and growth. One that does not mean forsaking the social institutions that have been annexed by the economy, currency markets and even wages, but reframes them according to different principles. So he's saying we continue with a market economy, we continue with a wage exploitation economy, we continue under global socialism, currencies as well, money and so on. We continue with the way things are now, but because basically that would otherwise, if we went further than that towards a completely different form of society without currencies, without markets, without wage labour, that would plunge society into chaos to get there. So reading Daly, I'm confused. I don't know what you think, but it seems a contradiction here. He starts off by saying we can't have degrowth without getting rid of capitalism, and then he presents the arguments about why we can't get rid of capitalism because we could cause chaos. So I leave you to think about whether this particular author for Degrowth has got his mind clear. Other authors, for example, want to go further than this. They're just saying it's not just a question of growth, it's the question of industrialization, of mechanization, and of moving away from a society which was simply based on agricultural labor, where people worked locally, got their food locally, and lived locally. There was no international or national system of organization for the economy. And that's the only way we can be ecologically sustainable. It doesn't matter whether it's on a capitalist market basis or whether it's on a socialist plan basis, makes no difference, because unless we have an ecological position on capitalist accumulation, then it's not going to work. So for these particular authors, any type of accumulation, as Callis said, a leading degrowther, the target of degrowth is not just capitalism, but also productivism. In other words, it's producing more that's the issue, the contradiction in our society, not whether it's a capitalist process of production, but production in general. There are absolute limits, so only social systems of a limited size or complexity can be governed. So therefore, they oppose even green megastructures like high-speed trains and industrial-scale wind farms because they see this as a process of productivism and not actually achieving the sustainable society ecologically. But not everybody in the degrowth area takes that view. Now, there's Kohei Saito, a Japanese Marxist scholar, who's written 2 books on this, Capital and the Anthropocene, and also more recently, the idea of degrowth communism. So he's saying that degrowth is actually connected and related and part of the process towards communism. That's Saito's position. He's an associate professor at Tokyo University, and this book on degrowth communism has been a smash hit in Japan. Over 500,000 sales. That was last year, so I don't know how many is sold now. And to give an example of just one reader, how they see it. Saito tells a story that is easy to understand, says one researcher whose samples were published. He doesn't say there are good and bad things about capitalism or that it's possible to reform it. He just says we have to get rid of the entire system. So this seems to be a different approach from this particular degrowth supporter. Saito argues that the environmental unsustainability of capitalism is the contradiction of the system, and that further Marx saw that metabolic rights, that I mean the control of the nature of society in relation to humanity, is the most serious problem of capitalism, and that it's the main contradiction within capitalism. So Saito, in his book, both his books, argues that Marx, well, first of all, that it's not capitalism that's the main contradiction of our society, it's the ecological crisis. Capitalism causes this economic crisis, this ecological crisis, but that is the real crisis. And he goes further than that. He says he has analysed Marx's later writings and claims that actually Marx saw that capitalism, the contradictions within capitalism were not the main problem. It was the contradictions within the whole environmental system was the main problem. So climate crisis, if you like, is an existential crisis, and that capitalism, the contradictions within capitalism are now secondary in a way to that crisis. People have criticised this and said if you go through Marx's writings and books, or any of them, they can't find any such statement that Marx takes that view. So that's one issue that Saito has been criticised for. So let me now come to a bit of a debate which took place between two main proponents. First of those against the idea of degrowth, that's Branko Milanovic, the ex-chief economist of the World Bank, and Jason Hickel, I mentioned before, who's probably the most sophisticated supporter of degrowth at the moment. Now, Milanovic presented a series of posts in which he attacked the position of degrowth. He says it's economically irrational and politically infeasible. So first of all, it doesn't make any sense economically. And secondly, it's not going to be possible to carry it out politically. So, well, we saw before some degrowthers say that it's not possible to get rid of capitalism because of it's politically infeasible. Milanovic turns that around and says it's degrowth that's politically infeasible. And Milanovic says, let's look at the economics. Unless we change the distribution of income, we're condemning to permanent abject poverty some 15% of the world population that currently earns under $1.90 a day, and a quarter of the humankind, actually I think the figure's higher than that, who earn less than $2 per day, $2.50 per day. This is a couple of years ago. Figures have changed a bit for the World Bank. But he's saying we've got this level of poverty in the world, and do we really think that degrowth is going to be able to transform that position for all those people in the so-called global south, in the poorest countries of the world? He says degrowth implies that we'd have to bring up all the bottom 72% so that we reduce the incomes of everybody above so that the entire world lives on a global mean average. So how much of a reduction will this imply for the global top 28%, which I'm sure you're aware is we are listening to this now and we're all in the top 28%. You may not feel like it, but in global terms, we are well inside the top 28%. And probably everybody in this screen is in the top 10%. I mean, it's staggering to think about how poor the majority of the world's population is to put the rest of us in the top 10%. But if you did that, then as Milanovic says, you work it out, it's a simple sum, the incomes of the top 28% would have to be cut by almost two-thirds. So you think about that. You want your incomes cut by two-thirds in order to carry out this degrowth program of redistribution of incomes to the global south. Factories, trains and airports and schools would have to work 1/3 of their normal time. Electricity, heating and hot water would only be available for 8 hours a day because we'd be trying to reduce the use of resources production. Cars would be driven 1 day out of 3. We would work only 13 hours a week. So we don't only produce only 1/3 as many goods and services that the West is producing now. That's the sort of reduction required, according to Milanovic, to achieve this degrowth sustainable society where everybody's getting an equal level of resources and there's no grotesque excesses amongst the rich. So given the fact that the world population is now still going to increase, it's just under 8 billion, it will still increase possibly to 9 billion according to UN figures at the moment. If GDP is fixed at some absolute amount and actually reduced for a sizable section of the population of the global north to sustain more people, in other words, mean incomes would have to drop. So not only would there be a redistribution between the poor and the rich, if you like to call that the rich, 20%, 28% would take a big cut in their incomes, but everybody would take a big cut in incomes if population still increases, and we're trying not to increase GDP or the total output of goods and services to meet that higher population. So those are Milanovich's arguments. Hickel came back strongly. He says, look, degrowth proponents like Hickel comes back and says, Milanovich is misrepresenting our argument because he, Milanovich, has a blind faith in economic growth and thinks we have to go on having more growth. But surely we should recognize that the world average GDP is poorly distributed and poorly utilized. Well, clearly it is. Milanovich's argument is that if you just redistribute it in a crude and abstract way, it will not solve the issue. You get degrowth only at the expense of large sections of the world's population taking a huge hit in their living standards. But Hegel says, look, degrowth is not about reducing GDP. So apparently it's not about reducing GDP. So degrowth is not degrowth. Degrowth is about reorganizing resources and energy in the direction of social need. When it comes to human well-being or social need, counting GDP is irrelevant, which I think is correct. It's not income itself that counts. It's the welfare purchasing power of income. So what people get in terms of their value of their labor power, in terms of their resources and their living conditions. That's what matters. So Hegel's saying we're not proposing we degrowth as to reduce GDP. We don't seek to scale down all the sectors, just the unnecessary and destructive ones. Well, I think that's a step back from what was being put forward by previous degrowthers, but it is a more, I would think, more convincing argument to say what we want is a reorganization of how we use GDP rather than trying to reduce it in the abstract. The recent scientific survey of 561 studies of people who support degrowth, and the guys went through all these reports, articles, etc., and they conclude that 90% of these studies are opinions. So there's no arguments about what the redistribution of income would be. There's no analysis in that sense. There's hardly any quantitative or qualitative data discussed about what it would mean for people's whether living standards would go up or down by their program. So it's really just an ad hoc and subjective view that's being presented by most of these studies. There's no system-wide perspective, no looking at what would happen in the economy, particularly in the global economy as a whole, but simply looking at what you could do locally if people didn't waste money or waste things on consuming various things or producing things, but redistribute them locally. And when they looked at what support there was for the idea of degrowth, they found that the majority of any of the surveys that were done on whether the public would support degrowth, every time the majority was against degrowth strategies as being politically infeasible. So those people who were asked were not convinced that degrowth was the way to pose the question of an alternative to the contradictions in capitalism. And the point I think we want to make here as socialists and Marxists is that it's completely incorrect to suggest that Marxists are just in favour of production for production's sake, with unlimited growth in GDP or in the production of things and services. As Marx has pointed out, under capitalism, there's a massive waste goes on. Capitalist production is thoroughly wasteful with human material, just as it's wasting its distributions of its products through trade and in competition. It wastes material resources, so it loses to society what it gains for the individual capitalist. We know this. If capitalists want to get an increased fossil fuel exploration or production and go into the Arctic, for example, and make holes in the Arctic to get oil out, they damage the world's environmental condition as a result of that. But they don't care about that. What gains for capitalists that matter, not the waste of resources and not the destruction of the environment, which matters to capitalists. So the wasteful, environmentally unsustainable consumption patterns of the workers' class if you say that's the situation for a section of the working class, that they buy things that they don't need, that they operate in an environmentally unsustainable environment as a result of capitalism, it's not by personal choice, it's by the process of capitalism itself. That's what I think Marxists would say in response to much of the degrowth authors' arguments. Perhaps I think we'd say that Marx and Engels saw the need for an institution of collective planning as the alternative to capitalist waste and destruction. In response to the contradictions of capitalism, we need collective planning. For example, Engels insisted on the need for socialist planning to overcome the ecological rift between town and country. A Marxist theory of metabolic rift, which I referred to, which Saito went on about, operating on a more general level, insisted on the need for a sustainable human development rather than just expansion for its sake, which damages nature, robs nature of its role in society. And perhaps one of the Marxists of the 20th century, Ernest Mandel, made a very clear point that we need controlled and planned growth with clearly defined priorities, not based on the demands of profit. But degrowth or zero growth is not the alternative to capitalism. It's an inhumane way of approaching the question, an abstract way, which doesn't really take us forward and doesn't explain to working people how we can change society. Surely the goal would be to scale down ecologically destructive and socially less necessary production while protecting and indeed enhancing parts of the economy aimed at human well-being and ecological regeneration. I think this is quite an important, if you want, theoretical point, or at least a point which helps us to understand the difference here. The degrowth is a concept which can be applied essentially the same way, both to wealthy countries and poor countries. So it's an abstraction. It's talking about reducing GDP levels, not about what's actually composed within that GDP and which bits of GDP we would like to expand and which bits we want to reduce. It just looks at the question, at least on the level of just talking the slogan degrowth, although Hickel presumably would disagree, rather than looking at the quality of that GDP and the nature of that GDP, whether it's in the interests of working people or in the grotesque excesses of capitalism, whether it's in the interests of the environment and society as a whole, or whether in the interests of the profit of individual capitalists. I mean, the real problem in the world at the moment is overcoming the imperialist exploitation of the global south by the big multinationals and banks and institutions and those within the global south of the world, their own businesses of the wage labour there, transforming the existing mode of production and creating a sustainable level of production. I mean, it's clear that many countries in the south with very low per capita incomes, which we've just been discussing, could not possibly afford degrowth. They have to have more growth in that sense. They could use sustainable development like real needs as access to water, food, healthcare, and education. So what we're talking about here is we just have an abstract term of degrowth. It takes us no way forward as far as I can see in providing an alternative to the terrible situation that capitalism is creating throughout the world. So let's just like to summarize now key points that I've just described so that we can just see whether they're relevant to what you want to discuss. So degrowth says they're opposed to this growth obsession. Growth. That's not the way to look at the world ahead. We must get people to recognize that growth is not matters. What economists go on about GDP all the time, and GDP growth. This is not the issue. The issue is that growth is actually damaging rather than beneficial to human beings and society in general. And in fact, there are absolute limits to growth. We'll run out of resources, environmental resources, natural resources, if we just go on growing and accumulating and producing. This productivist approach is only going to bring us to an existential crisis, as Saito argued. So we're against productivism, says the degrowthers. We should be against productivism. I put it in quotes because that's the term they use, and the accumulation that flows into that. And if anything, we should return to a more simple society, a simple agricultural process, local produce for local people, away from these huge expansions of international trade in food and so on, which is destroying the environment, adulterating the food, destroying local communities and so on. Another aspect of their position is the degrowth risk. So although having said all those things, but there are points we have to take up about growth. First, in my view, we're not saying, Marxists are not saying that we want productivism. We just want growth, growth, growth for the sake. Accumulate for the accumulation's sake is actually a capitalist position, not a Marxist one. And that we're not productivists. That doesn't mean to say that we don't see the need for the expansion of the economies around the world, particularly in the global south, that they can meet social need. And as I pointed out, both Marx and Engels were aware of the environmental and waste environmental damage and the waste caused by capitalism, and how there was a contradiction between what the capitalists are driving for and the maintenance not only of decent conditions for human labor, but also for nature itself. So what we need is not degrowth as such, but planning for social needs. A couple of authors here, Mandela mentioned, Max Huber, around now, who also produces some good stuff on explaining how planning for social needs could operate in a socialist economy, an economy where production is not for profit, where accumulation is not for accumulation's sake. And as I say, degrowth seems to have an abstract view, which is just reduced GDP, which would be totally inhumane, not only to the global south, because it wouldn't really do anything, they need more growth there, but also it would mean an inhumane policy for large sections of working people in the so-called global north as well. So it's putting in this carte blanche idea and slogan of degrowth doesn't take us any way forward. And for that matter, it's pretty clear the working class would recognise it. I mean, working class is probably not aware of this degrowth theory very much, but insofar as they've become aware of it, there would be no support for this approach. So if people think this is a politically feasible alternative to struggling for a socialist transformation of society, they're deluding themselves, and they're also diverting us, if that's what we accept this idea, from the class struggle that's inevitably involved to really get a better society. So I think those are the general points and criticisms I want to make about degrowth, and I hope that we'll see much more from everybody else.
Okay. Thank you so very, very much, Michael. So very, very much. Okay. So now we're going to open the floor for questions. Each person will have up to 2 minutes to ask a question. And then I will take 3 questions and go back to Michael and give him 5 minutes to answer the questions on the first round. Okay. So I don't see anything in the chat as yet. I'm waiting for hands to go up. Don't be shy.
There's a couple hands.
Okay, so if you're seeing Anne's, who did I hear speak?
Flo and Hans have our hands up.
Well, I guess I don't see you on my screen. Sorry about that. So you got your hand up, Flo? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll start with you, Flo. Thank you. You have 2 minutes.
Thanks. Thank you, Michael, for that presentation. It was so interesting and enlightening. I have a kind of like a broad question, I guess, kind of going back to the start of the presentation when you're talking about the steady state economy or society, versus obviously the capitalist growth hungry model. And it did get me thinking about contradictions in capitalism and, on a very kind of broad philosophical basis. So hopefully you'll indulge me. It might take me a minute to get all these thoughts out here. But I was thinking about the relationship between, austerity and deprivation and manufactured scarcity as a capitalist, political economy, and how that mode of production and, politics itself drives and really like underpins the growth model. So if we can kind of maybe tease something about that out, because that's very like fascinating to me, and I think something that maybe people don't recognize so much, but that there's something in austerity and exploitation and the looting and the skimming and the rent seeking that's built into capitalist accumulation. that necessitates growth itself. Because if we had universal basic services, public investment, the basic needs and social needs of the working class actually taken care of, sustainability wouldn't be predicated on expansion and exploiting others, right? It's kind of that same logic of capital accumulation that drove colonialism and imperialism, that kind of cannibalistic, self-devouring, pattern and nature of capitalist production. So, yeah, if you want to just explore that kind of and the relationship between austerity versus public provisioning,
Time's up, Cameron.
growth, and steady state.
Okay, I have Hans next, and then I have one that came in the chat, and then we will go back to the speaker. But and John Wonderlich will be the first speaker up. Next round. Okay, Hans.
We sum up the 20th century in brutal terms. We would have to admit that it's the century of the defeat of socialism, largely due to the betrayal of the social democracy and the excesses of Stalinism that the Soviet Union decayed into. So therefore, I think my main question is degrowth not simply a flight away from the necessity for socialism? And I think you've said so much that unless we get to the point of explaining away these significant factors that led to the decline of socialism, that we are not going to win this battle, even for existential survival of humanity.
Thank you, Hans. Okay, the question in the chat is from Mark Lister, and it says, do degrowth advocate support a just transition for workers in unnecessary industries? Example, marketing, arms, etc. And how do they see it working? And I think I'll go, because I just got one hand up, Michael, to the fourth question and give you 6 minutes instead of 5 to respond. John Wonderlich, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Elizabeth. My question has to do with interstate versus intrastate analysis. So much of the critique that you laid out, Professor Roberts, was, it seemed to me, framed in the view of capitalism as state enterprise and the political project within the state. But the degrowth or eco-socialist view seems to much more be in interstate rather than intrastate, and that's two problem sets and two sets of framing that didn't seem to be addressed in what you said. I'm wondering if you can talk about intrastate versus interstate and interstate, and possibly whether decolonization is part of the framing of that discussion. Thanks. Big fan of your blog, by the way.
Thank you for your questions. We'll go back to Michael. You have 6 minutes, Michael.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, austerity versus public provision. Well, yes, I think that if you could imagine, if we had a movement in the advanced countries like Canada, the United States, or Britain, and so on, which had some traction in the media, and it was saying the solution to our problems here is we've got a list of things here, which includes things like basic public services and so on. We support all those, but to achieve that, we've got to reduce growth. We've got to cut the GDP in order to switch it to have a stationary society, and some of the basic services will be then produced in that society because we've taken it all off the capitalists, the rich capitalists, and we'll taking the money off the resources, unnecessary resources in the hands of the multinationals and the excessive waste that's going on. Now, I think most working people say, well, how are you going to do that? I mean, how are you going to get control of an economy by which you can achieve the position of meeting all these things like universal basic services? And yet you're going to achieve that by reducing GDP. That doesn't make any sense. And that seems to me the issue that degrowthers have to answer. I think socialists can answer that. We would say, well, we want basic public services, and they would only be possible if we hold control major sectors of the economy, the banks, the big firms. We bring them into a planned system for investment where we divert resources away from arms, away from marketing, from advertising, from capitalist profit to the areas of basic social need that people need. That program, when we present that amongst the public at large, or even small groups, in my experience, gets a lot of support. We know, we look at the data, for example, on public opinion polls and public ownership. When people are asked, are you in favour of public ownership of the railways? Are you in favour of public ownership of the big energy companies? Are you in favour of public ownership of the utilities? Are you in favour even of the public ownership of the banks? Majorities are in favour of those, including voters who vote Conservative. So there's a view amongst the general public that makes sense. If you were to say to them, well, are you in favour of cutting GDP and reducing your incomes by 2/3 in order to redistribute the resources in a more effective way? I think there would not be very much support for such an approach. And it's not necessary to approach it that way. So that's how I would answer this question of austerity versus public provision. And in fact, as Hans pointed out, in effect, this is a diversion. It's diverting us from the attention of how we present the arguments for socialism in the current position in the 21st century, after all the setbacks we've had in the 20th century through the growth of neoliberalism, the defeat of labour movements, and an alternative. Working people at the moment still probably, I mean, there's quite a large support for what I've just described as would be a planned economy, or socialist economy, democratic, but there's absolutely no credible belief on the part of working people that that's possible. And they look around at the political options that they've got in front of them, that none of that is offered to them in any meaningful sense. And therefore there's cynicism and disillusion about what direction to take. I don't think adding a degrowth slogan to our position, socialists, would help us very much in transforming that position. So again, it's a politically infeasible and diverting factor that's involved in this process. And I think John says, well, degrowth is talking globally, and when we talk about GDP, it's national, so it's national versus global. True. But when we think about what the issues are globally, that we have a periodic exploitation of the vast majority of the population by big multinationals, and that we need to end that. We need to break the grip of finance capital and the big multinationals over the poor countries of the world. We need to develop socialist movements there to present to them the argument that they have to join the degrowth campaign. I don't think we'll go down too well. As one socialist, Rubina says in the chat, how can degrowth help working class in poor countries where poor nations are struggling just for basic needs and employment? Again, it's an abstract slogan which doesn't take us any forward. If you want to debate with Jason Hickel, and that's the person to debate with, then he will say, we don't mean that. We don't mean that. We want a redistribution of resources in the interest of the population as a whole. Well, if that's what you want, why do you need the phrase degrowth? That's my reply. I can't understand why we need to have this particular term or slogan or program presented to us as something better than what we can present as a socialist alternative. I'm not sure if I've covered all the questions, but there you are for the moment. Sorry, Elizabeth.
Hey, thank you. Yes, I think you covered also the one that was in the chat. The other one, I don't know, is from Desmond. What are the steps of degrowth and simultaneously better growth, and how do we implement these? If you haven't answered that one. And that's the only one. I don't see anything else in the chat, and
Yeah.
I'm looking for hands on the screen, Carrie. I don't see any. I'll come back to you, Flo, if there's no first-time speakers. Barry, go ahead. You're muted.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Michael, for a very stimulating talk, very well illustrated. presentation. I'm going to ask rather prosaically a question about quantity. We know that there's enormous waste in the trillions of dollars where it concerns military production. In fact, the military is the chief user of carbon fuels in the world. And I'm talking about more than one military, but one in particular comes to mind. Advertising, false advertising more often than not, and packaging, excessive packaging, unnecessary, duplicating packaging. And I'm just wondering, and I'm not putting this on you, Michael, but if there's some way to quantify that waste in just those areas and any others you want to add, I think that would help us to bridge the gap between what we advocate as socialists for, a healthy society, a good society, and what the bourgeois experts tell us is just not feasible. And the second point, I guess, is a little bit more emotive. There's a catastrophe unfolding in Los Angeles. I don't know if Jeff is going to draw attention to it because he lives in San Francisco, which is not too far, closer than I am. There's a catastrophe unfolding there. Thousands of buildings have been destroyed, over a dozen people killed, and it would be much higher if this was a third world country where it was happening. With the exception of Cuba, which takes good care of its people. It's catastrophic to see what's happening in Los Angeles and California, not unlike what happened in British Columbia just a year or so ago, and what happened in Florida not so long ago. So really, that poses the question, how can we afford not to address the proliferation of carbon fuel emissions into the upper atmosphere? How can we not see that as an area that must be cut? That a lot of the oil and gas must simply stay in the ground, and that the workers in those industries have to be retooled and re-educated to perform useful work, perhaps in house building or in childcare provision, whatever the case may be. So those are my sort of remarks and questions. Can we quantify the waste? Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll go back with 5 minutes for these. So Desmond's question and Barry's, and then I'll come back to the audience. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, well, Desmond says, what are the steps to degrowth and simultaneous better growth, and how do we implement these? Well, quite sure, but I think Desmond's saying, if we're not going for degrowth, what are the steps to get support for better growth? Well, I think basically discussing the idea of a plan that meets social needs rather than private profit, and which just an accumulation, hugely wasting not only in consumption but also in production and resources that we have under capitalism known as remind you of the quotes of Marx and Engels on this question about waste. And as has been pointed out by Barry, that it would be great if we could quantify just how much is being wasted and misused under the capitalist system in terms of resources, of human labor power, not leaving aside the environmental damage, which is one thing, but just even on the level of looking at within GDP, how much of that is just unnecessary production. To give the due to degrowth, raising the theorists who are raising this question of unnecessary, excessive production in areas which don't help social need for the majority of people in this world. So we know about arms spending, which is in the hundreds of, it's in the trillions. In the case of the United States, it's currently hitting $1 trillion a year. Just think, if we transferred $1 trillion a year away from arms spending and we put it into socially needed areas, or not just on welfare, but on providing jobs for people to be transferred from fossil fuel industry and other environmentally damaging areas to more socially useful areas for the population, $1 trillion would go a huge way. I mean, President Biden, with his last week, will, if he had the opportunity, remind us he introduced a program which he called the Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't make any sense, but within that was $1 trillion is going to be spent over 10 years to try and transform the US economy into something more successful and productive, not necessarily in areas that mattered, but $1 trillion over 10 years. Every year now, the US is spending $1 trillion on arms to carry out wars and maintain 731 bases around the world, including Greenland, in order to sustain the position of US imperialism. Well, if that's just the US, I mean, I know the rest of the world's arms spending doesn't add up to the US. The rest of the world in total doesn't add up to the US arms spending. But if we, in the case of the UK, for example, which obviously I can do a bit more about, we're spending 2.5% of our GDP on arms, just alone, to produce useless weapons, which don't work apparently in Ukraine, in order to help the US to sustain their position around the world, 2.5% of our GDP, which we have a UK finance minister, we call him her a chancellor, who is absolutely in a state of desperation. She doesn't know how to get growth. We're talking about degrowth. She doesn't know how to get the British economy going. And yet she's already raised taxes and cut welfare and so on. But she's not going to cut arms spending at 2.5% of GDP. She had that in her hands. She could transform the position every year. But it's even worse than that, because all the NATO countries are now being asked to go to 3% or 4% or 5% of GDP in order to continue this position of NATO, which is no longer a Western European defense quotes organization, but a global organization designed to maintain the military position of the United States and its allies. That's just one area you can quantify very easily. But as Barry said, think about all the advertising and waste. I don't know about you, but I am sick to death of putting on the TV set and seeing a load of completely pointless ads, usually about betting, in our case of the UK. I mean, we seem to be wanting to bet all the time, gaming and so on, massive expenditure. The richest person in the UK is the head of Bet365. She's the richest person in the UK because people spend money on hoping they can get their lives transformed by putting bets and the tremendous promotion of that. And because we've seen that in the question of smoking and all kinds of other areas where there's total waste, massive expenditure goes on, pharmaceutical spending, advertising for all sorts of low obesity drugs and all kinds of other things that go on all the time. It's a huge, huge waste of money when a publicly owned National Health Service could actually aim all those resources that are wasted on advertising for drugs in the direction that meets people's needs with decent hospitals, without waiting lists, without meeting the difficulties that so many people have with their disabilities and illness. And you know, well, I don't know about Canada, but in the US, life expectancy is falling, and the level of conditions in the health service is deteriorating, although it's the most expensive health service in the world as a percentage of GDP. So the US is spending 16% of its GDP on health, but more of that ends up in health insurance and in doctors' fees. And
30 seconds.
It doesn't end up in people's needs. That's why there's a divergence between health expenditure and spending. So if we cut, you could actually, want degrowth, you could cut health spending by half in the US if you have a publicly provisioned health system which meets people's needs at the point of use.
Thank you. Okay, so are there any first-time speakers? I have people second time around, but I'm looking for first time. Somebody has a question? No, there's nothing in the chat. Okay, so we'll go back to the two speakers. Flo, 2 minutes, and then John, 2 minutes for your questions. Go ahead, Flo.
Yeah, so following up on the last question, you're saying, yeah, people are generally supportive of public investment and, socialized things, the nationalization. So why call it degrowth, especially when you add that caveat that, okay, you have to reduced GDP and maybe your incomes, according to folks like Branko. And I think that, to me, that also poses an opportunity to kind of talk about GDP itself as a measure of economic health and what actually goes into, calculating that data point. And, as what we've been talking about, I definitely tend to agree with Jason Hickel kind of side of things in terms of interpreting at least what a more reasonable and rational understanding of degrowth would mean. And you would think that, as Barry was saying, and as we understand, the financialization of the economy and the rent seeking and all this has led to, I mean, it's a faster way to accumulate capital, which is why the capitalists have moved away from productive investment in the first place, right? So do you not think that to some extent, just through the process of kind of returning to public investment and direct market investment to return productive capacity to the economy would functionally lead to some kind of degrowth? Let's say in the political situation, hypothetically, that we had some, democratic planning of the economy. But given like the extent of financialized fictitious capital that actually exists in our measurement of GDP currently. Like, I guess what I'm getting at too is I understand, I think I agree with you that, we shouldn't, as Marxists, try to sort of co-opt degrowth, or we don't necessarily like need it to incorporate into our analysis. But maybe a better way to think about incorporating it is like, if you want to see degrowth, you're going to have a Marxist analysis of the economy anyway, or the political economy, because you're never going to get degrowth under a capitalist political economy. I think I agree on that. So anyway, just kind of a comment, but I'll throw that out there about the GDP.
Okay, so a question in the chat, and then we'll go to John from Rubina. When developing countries try to do degrowth, multinational companies move to underdeveloping countries, which is affecting fast climate change. How could it be decreased or stopped? And the last question to go to Michael is from John. Go ahead, John.
Hi again. It's actually kind of in the same line as what Rubina just said. Because when we talk about the advanced capitalist countries, the problem is clear, and the level of exploitation in the global south, the 24 or 25% underneath $2.50 a day, but the middle income countries, or the BRICS countries, are maybe the laboratory for this question, because they're simultaneously needing to grow and are also dealing, especially in coastal countries, to deal with the consequences of climate change. So whether it's China or Brazil or India, they're all taking different paths and having to deal with that. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, and I think Mark said earlier, we have a whole separate podcast about this class nature of the Chinese state. I'm not inviting that conversation, but just as a BRICS country, how do you? They seem to be trying to do both by developing electric and other options, but still needing to use fossil fuel to get to a sustainable, to a bare sustainable level for their population. So, where does BRICS fit in this analysis?
Thank you, John. Okay, we'll go back to Michael. 5 minutes, Michael.
Well, thank you. Flo's point about GDP is very relevant, it seems to me, that GDP is a measure introduced by a mainstream economist back in the 50s called Simon Kuznets, because they wanted to measure the health of the capitalist economy. They want to see, from the point of view of capitalists, they want to see whether there's increased production, more sales are being made in monetary terms of goods and services. They needed a measure of that they could use to gauge what was going on. So gross domestic product became that key measure, which Kuznets worked out as a way of using. You mentioned before that, before they had GDP, they didn't really have a measure. There was just a view of things were going up or things weren't going so well. They didn't have a very clear. It's trying to be more precise from the point of view of capitalist calculation. But of course, GDP is full of all kinds of things which we as socialists and working people would consider, are not really improvements in the health of society. It might be of interest to capitalists. So as you correctly say, a big increase in financial profits of the big banks and insurance companies is in GDP. But for us, how does that help society and the majority of people? So GDP is a completely inefficient, inadequate measure of what is really worthwhile for society as a whole. It's quite a good measure for capitalists. So that's why we poor old economists, whether we're Marxist or not, have to look at it all the time in order to make a judgment of how well capitalism is doing, because that's what the capitalists are considering. Of course, they don't like to talk about what really matters for capitalists is how well profits are doing. You never see that much except in the pages of the financial pages about how each company is making a profit. But economists don't talk about profits and profitability in GDP. They only talk about production or investment or consumption. You go into GDP and look at the composition of GDP, there's nothing about profits. So that it's on the one hand, supposedly a more efficient way of trying to see what's happening with capitalism. On another way, it's hiding what the true contradictions are in capitalism and its health. And of course, from the point of view of the majority of the population, whether they're in the global north or the global south, it's not a very good gauge of social well-being and so on. In that sense, what Jason Hickel says and others say is absolutely correct. What we're debating here is not so much whether GDP is a load of rubbish, but whether degrowth adds anything to our approach to deal with that in the future. John raises the question of the BRICS. It's a big question about whether they can play a role in changing that situation. All I would say is at the moment is that, well, and it's another big discussion, is that the BRICS attempt, as it were, to provide some sort of alternative to the role of US imperialism and so on, is very limited indeed. We're talking about countries that are still, where the majority of the population is highly exploited, and that when they trade and get investment, they're exploited by the big multinationals of the north. The middle income countries are still in severe difficulty. And it's not really, in my view, possible that the grouping of the BRICS will provide a clear alternative to that situation. I have to fall back on the old-fashioned position of socialism. It's the working class in those countries that matter, and that I don't have much faith in Putin, in Modi, in the head of Saudi Arabia, or the Iranian mullahs as providing us with an anti-imperialist direction. I tend to look towards the working people in those countries. If we had socialist change in those countries, democratic socialist governments coming to power, bringing together BRICS, that would be a massive change. And that remains our issue, doesn't it? Whether it's in Canada, the US, or whether it's in Brazil. Well, how are we going to get the working class into power in order to bring about the global change that we need? Because now the issues of the 21st century are no longer issues just of one country or a group of countries. They're issues for the globe now. I mean, we face the possibility of world war again. We face the possibility of environmental collapse and existential disaster, that the costs of climate change, global warming is increasing to a huge level, and something's got to be done. The IMF chief, Georgieva, said yesterday, something's got to be done. Well, yes, I know, but what's she going to do? What can she do? Because
30 seconds.
Yeah, at the same time as she's saying something's got to be done, all the major banks are pulling out of net zero financing. They're not going to finance climate change and mitigation measures against global warming. And fossil fuel production is increasing. And as correctly pointed out, countries that are trying to change that are still having to use a huge amount of fossil fuel to achieve it. The difference is that whereas the US per capita's fossil fuel carbon emissions is massively high, China has high carbon emissions, but per person, it's way, way lower. And they're trying to avoid that process. And so are many middle-income countries. But how can they do that unless they have the resources and the control of all the major economies and the major sectors of the economy globally? That's the task that's ahead. And that's the crisis which exists in capitalism.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so I have time for three more questions. I have An's hand up. So is there anybody that hasn't asked a question yet that would like to do so? This is the last round. No. Anybody that has spoken before like to speak again? No. Okay, so I have one question, and that is from Ans, and he has up to 2 minutes, and then we will go back to Michael, and you can take 6 minutes to answer the questions and do a wrap up if you so wish, Michael, and something you might want to tell us that you haven't so far. It's up to the time will be yours to use or not use. Okay, go ahead, Ans.
Well, just to recap about the phenomenal waste in the capitalist system, an example is the 100 different car manufacturers on this planet that produce essentially the same product. I noticed that Honda and Nissan have announced a merger plan. That's an aside. I want to ask the elephant in the room question in Canada and the US, and that's slightly off topic, but degrowth is forecast as the doom consequence of the 25% tariff.
I tried to raise my hand, but it didn't work.
The 25% tariff disaster that Trump is invoking for North America and specifically for Canada. Pardon me for being slightly off topic, but as I said, it's the burning question of the day here in Canada.
Okay, so I see another hand up, a late hand, but I will give him the opportunity. 2 minutes, and then we're going to go back to Michael. Barry.
Yeah, my apologies. The raise the hand symbol wasn't working on my on my screen, so apologies. But I'm simply going to add to the argument I made earlier by reading a sentence from Monthly Review magazine, which this is the summer edition, Imperialism in the Indo-Pacific, which is where 60% of production occurs. If we don't address that issue there, then there's going to be little progress. But in the final article on China and decarbonization, the following is written. To achieve the target of limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, 80% of global primary energy demand must be drawn from renewable energy sources by 2030.
Yeah.
2030, that's 5 years from now. And all fossil fuel sources phased out by 2050. That's not very long into the future. So we're looking at a really existential crisis. And regardless what anybody will say about what is feasible and not feasible, unless these targets are achieved, and I'm not saying it has to be through degrowth per se, but transforming the nature of production and consumption in like capitalism, then there will be no capitalism, no socialism, no working class. There are no jobs under 10 meters of water. It's proven. So we need to recognize that something must be done, and it will not be done unless through democratic planning. There's no other way. The corporations that have profited from pillaging the resources of the world, including human labor, are not going to do it voluntarily. There's no sign of it. None of them advocate it, even if you would be, credulous with regard to what they say. So there's nothing short of a global socialist revolution, which has to be conducted country by country. There's no such thing as a worldwide simultaneous revolution, but revolution nonetheless is absolutely essential for human survival and for the survival of, Mother Earth. We don't have a plan B or a planet B.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go back for final words from Michael. You have 6 minutes if you wish them, Michael. Go ahead.
Thank you, Elizabeth. What Hans said, of course, raising the question of our new US president who comes into office next Tuesday week, and we're all looking forward to that. That when he comes into office, he's made very clear what he wants to do. That he's going to raise the tariffs across the board for most countries. He's using this as sort of a bargaining weapon, I think, to force various countries to carry out policies that will be interests of the US. He is he's making a bonfire of regulations on fossil fuel and climate change mitigation. He plans to do that. So, it'll be drill, drill, drill for more oil and so on. So all the process of tariffs, of getting rid of regulations on the climate and so on, that's his program. And his program also is to increase the position and strength of American capital against other capitals, for that matter. So the purpose of this exercise, I think somebody put it the other day, that we're returning to the Monroe Doctrine, where the US has its sphere of influence in North and South America, including you lovely people in Canada. You will be told what to do, and that sphere of influence will be maintained. Who cares what happens to what's going on in Europe? Europe can go down a sinkhole as far as he's concerned, because the important thing is to keep America strong in the Western Hemisphere. And as Barry says, it's the Western Hemisphere, or the Pacific Hemisphere, which has always been the direction in many ways of American imperialism, that becomes the crucial point. So are we going to see a further measures of American imperialism's influence over the rest of the faster expanding part of the global South, which of course is East Asia and so on, and in particular China, Indonesia and so on? That is an issue for the 21st century. Is going to take place now under the new administration over the next 4 years. We'll see how that develops. But what is clear, and as I can't disagree with anything that Barry has said, is that these are the issues of the rest of this decade and beyond. And if they're not resolved in the direction of the interests of the majority of humanity, then, as he says, it is the majority of humanity who are going to badly suffer, particularly the poorest parts of humanity, plus, of course, the rest of the species in the planet and the planet itself. I only just saw last week that we have gone beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial level of temperature. It's gone in 2024. And yes, it's not an average yet, but it will be. And so the target of the Paris Agreement in 2016 is not being met. It's gone. And as he's pointed out, there's no way that we're getting anywhere near the level of reductions and mitigation of fossil fuel emissions and renewable replacement that the targets require. So this is a crisis, leaving aside the question of whether we need to have a degrowth target or not. These are the questions that really we face over the next decade or so.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you again, Michael, for your excellent presentation and discussion, and taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. And thanks to our IT staff person, Kiri, and to our political producer, Barry, and also to everybody that was live. And of course, the webcast is recorded, so to our audience who will listen to us later. And remember, as I said, the webcast is recorded and will be posted onto the Socialist Action YouTube channel. I invite everyone to visit www.socialistaction.ca. If you would like to know more about our party and possibly to join SA, please provide your e-address on the website and call 647-986-1917. The next SA webcast will occur on Thursday, February the 13th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on the topic Resisting the New McCarthyism in Canada. Long before October 7, 2023, Canada's laws and institutions shielded Israel and perpetrated Zionist ideology. Over the past year, the Canadian state increasingly targeted pro-Palestinian activists and protesters against genocide, with charges and jail time, while finding underhanded ways to punish pro-Palestine speech through initiatives such as the Canadian Handbook on the IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism. The sharp right and aggressive anti-democratic tactics pursued by the state to crack down on free speech is a shameful intimidation campaign on behalf of the powerful proxy of empire. Join us for a discussion with British Columbia Civil Liberties Association lawyer Aslan Jackson and the Montreal-based political analyst and head of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, Eve Engler, to find out what is happening, what it means, and how we can fight back. Join us on February 13th at 7 p.m. Currently, Socialist Action is conducting its annual fund drive. We are trying to raise money to keep SA resources, including party literature, media, and staff at the service of workers in the class struggle. So please donate generously if you can by sending a bank e-transfer to barryaw@rogers.com. Thanks again to everyone for today's webcast who made today's webcast possible. Let's continue the struggle for equal socialism and workers' power. Please keep in touch. Stay healthy and stay active.